Here's something they don't tell you in history class. Teddy Roosevelt once banned Christmas trees from the White House. Yes, the same man who kept a bear as a pet and got shot during a speech and just kept talking decided that cutting down evergreens for Christmas was where he drew the environmental line. His sons naturally smuggled one into their bedroom closet anyway, because apparently even presidential children in 1902 understood that some rules are meant to be broken. And that's just one of the strange, quietly fascinating things that have happened during White House Christmases over the past 2 centuries. From first ladies hanging laundry in ballrooms to presidents chasing runaway goats down Pennsylvania Avenue, the holiday season at America's most famous address has always been just a little bit weirder than you'd expect. If you enjoy learning weird historical facts while drifting off to sleep, go ahead and subscribe. We do this sort of thing regularly, so get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and let's explore 20 hidden Christmas secrets from the White House that you've probably never heard before, starting with that Christmas tree ban and the children who defied it. The White House once banned Christmas trees. So here's the thing about Teddy Roosevelt that you probably didn't learn in school. The man who loved big game hunting, who kept a literal bear as a pet, who once got shot during a speech and just kept talking. That same man banned Christmas trees from the White House. Yes, really. The year was 1902, and Roosevelt had decided that cutting down trees for a holiday tradition was environmentally irresponsible, which, honestly, fair point. The man was genuinely concerned about deforestation in America, and he wasn't exactly quiet about it either. He'd go on to establish 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and over 150 national forests during his presidency. So when Christmas rolled around, he looked at the tradition of dragging an evergreen into your living room and said, essentially, no, we're not doing that. Now you'd think the presidential children would simply accept this decree and move on with their lives, maybe celebrate with some nice garland or something. But if you thought that, you clearly don't understand how Roosevelt children operated. His sons, Archie and Quentin, who were about 8 and 5 years old at the time, decided that their father's environmental ban was more of a suggestion, a challenge, if you will. So they did what any rebellious children would do. They smuggled a Christmas tree into the White House, and not a small one either. They managed to hide a full-size evergreen in a closet in their bedroom. Can you imagine the logistics of this? 2 small children somehow acquiring a tree, dragging it through the White House corridors, and stuffing it into a closet without anyone noticing. The sheer audacity. The story goes that Gifford Pinchot, who was Roosevelt's chief forester and probably the person most responsible for putting the tree ban idea in Roosevelt's head in the first place, discovered the contraband tree. And here's where it gets interesting. Pinchot, instead of backing up the president's ban, apparently told the boys that cutting down trees could actually be good for forest management when done correctly. You know, thinning out overcrowded areas, preventing disease, that sort of thing. So the boys marched up to their father and presented their case, backed by the very expert who'd inspired the ban in the first place. Roosevelt, to his credit, actually listened. And the ban was quietly lifted. The irony here is just delicious, isn't it? The president who wanted to save the forests ended up being convinced by his elementary school-age children that Christmas trees were fine, actually. And from that point on, the Roosevelt White House had Christmas trees again. Though Roosevelt never quite lived down the whole banned Christmas narrative that followed him. Political opponents occasionally used it against him, painting him as some sort of holiday-hating tyrant, which was deeply unfair considering the man absolutely loved Christmas. He just had opinions about forestry. What's remarkable is how this one family decision echoed through American culture. Roosevelt's initial concern about conservation wasn't wrong. It just needed some nuance, which his sons and Gifford Pinchot helpfully provided. And now, Over a century later, we have entire industries built around sustainable Christmas tree farming, where trees are specifically grown for the holiday and replanted after harvest. Roosevelt would probably appreciate that, even if he'd roll his eyes at how the whole thing started with his kids staging a tiny rebellion in a White House closet. The whole episode is very on brand for the Roosevelt family, honestly. Nothing was ever simple with them, but of course, Teddy Roosevelt wasn't the first president to deal with Christmas tree drama in the White House. The first ever indoor White House Christmas tree was considered strange. Before Teddy Roosevelt was banning Christmas trees and his sons were smuggling them back in, there was another president who had to convince Americans that indoor Christmas trees weren't completely bizarre. His name was Benjamin Harrison, and in 1889, he decided to do something that many Americans considered deeply foreign and possibly suspicious. He put a Christmas tree inside the White House. Not on the lawn, not in a garden, inside, in the actual residence. And people had opinions about this. You have to understand, this was still a relatively new concept in America. Christmas trees had become popular in parts of Europe, particularly Germany, but they hadn't fully caught on in the United States yet. There were Americans who saw the decorated evergreen as a strange pagan ritual that had somehow gotten tangled up with Christianity. Others thought it was just unnecessarily German, which in the 1800s was apparently a personality trait people worried about. Harrison, though, didn't particularly care about any of this. He had young grandchildren living in the White House, Benjamin Harrison McKee, who everyone called Baby McKee, and his sister Mary. And Harrison wanted them to have a proper, magical Christmas. So he set up a tree in the second floor oval room, decorated it with candles and toys, and basically dared anyone to complain about it. The tree itself was placed on a table to elevate it, making it easier to see and also slightly safer for the candles that served as lights. Because yes, they used actual open flames on a dead, dry tree inside a wooden building. This was just how people lived back then, apparently accepting a level of fire risk that would make modern safety inspectors weep into their clipboards. The decorations were modest by today's standards. Some glass ornaments, strings of popcorn, paper chains made by the children, small toys, and those terrifying candles. But for Harrison's grandchildren, it was enchanting. The press coverage was mixed. Some newspapers praised Harrison for bringing a charming tradition to the White House, something that made the presidency feel more accessible and family-oriented. Other publications were less enthusiastic, with a few journalists questioning whether the president should be promoting what they considered a foreign custom. There were even some religious groups who wrote letters expressing concern that Christmas was becoming too commercialized and that these decorative trees were part of the problem, which, in hindsight, is kind of funny because they had no idea how commercialized it would eventually become. The 1889 version of Christmas was absolutely quaint compared to what we're dealing with now. But here's what actually mattered. People saw pictures of the Harrison White House Christmas tree in newspapers and magazines, and they wanted one too. The President of the United States, the most powerful man in the country, had put a tree in his house, and suddenly it seemed less weird and more aspirational. Within a few years, indoor Christmas trees became increasingly common in American homes. Harrison had accidentally normalized the whole thing just by doing it himself and letting the press cover it. The tradition stuck around at the White House after Harrison left office, though not every president embraced it with the same enthusiasm. Some years the trees were grand and elaborate. Other years they were modest or even absent. It really depended on who was living there and what their personal feelings about Christmas traditions were. But Harrison had opened the door, quite literally, to the idea that a Christmas tree belonged inside the most famous house in America. And if you think the Harrison family's Christmas setup was challenging, well, you should hear about what was happening in the White House a few decades earlier. When the building wasn't even finished yet, Abigail Adams used the East Room to dry laundry at Christmas. Let's go back even further to the very beginning, when the White House was barely a house at all. The year was 1800, and Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, the second president, had just moved into the brand new presidential residence, except it wasn't really brand new in the fresh and finished sense. It was more like technically has walls and a roof. The place was a construction zone. There was plaster dust everywhere. Half the rooms didn't have doors. The main staircase wasn't finished. And it was absolutely bone-chillingly cold. Now, 1800 wasn't just the year the Addams family moved in. It was also, unfortunately for them, the year they had to celebrate Christmas in this freezing, incomplete mansion. And Abigail Adams, being an exceptionally practical person, had to figure out how to make the household function in these conditions. One of her biggest challenges was laundry. They couldn't hang wet clothes outside because it was December and everything would just freeze solid. Most of the upstairs rooms were either unfinished or so cold that nothing would dry properly anyway. So Abigail looked around at the available spaces and made a decision that would probably horrify modern White House staff. She started hanging the family's laundry in the East Room. The East Room, if you're not familiar, is now the largest room in the White House. It's where presidents hold press conferences, state dinners, and major receptions. It's elegant and formal and absolutely not a place where you'd expect to see someone's damp undergarments draped over furniture. But in 1800, it was just a big, empty, unfinished space that happened to be slightly warmer than the rest of the building because it faced south and got better sunlight. Abigail strung up clotheslines and turned it into a massive laundry drying room. There are accounts of visitors being surprised to find the presidential laundry just hanging there in what was supposed to be a formal stateroom. Imagine being a dignitary visiting the President of the United States and having to walk past drying sheets and stockings to get to your meeting. The whole situation was absurd, but also very revealing about what life was actually like in the early White House. This wasn't a palace. It was barely a functional home. The Addams family had to make it work with what they had, and what they had was an enormous, drafty, unfinished building in the middle of what was essentially a construction site. The city of Washington, D.C. itself was barely developed at this point. There were more trees than buildings. The roads were mud tracks. The whole thing was tremendously inconvenient. Abigail wrote letters to family members complaining about the conditions, and her descriptions are honestly hilarious in a exhausted, long-suffering way. She mentioned needing to keep 13 fires going just to make parts of the house livable. She talked about how they didn't have enough wood, how the bells to summon servants didn't work properly, and how she was constantly cold. Christmas in the White House that year couldn't have been particularly festive. There's no record of any celebrations or decorations. It was probably just the Addams family trying to stay warm and dry and get through the winter in this enormous, incomplete building. The laundry situation continued for the few months the Addams family lived there before John Adams lost the 1800 election to Thomas Jefferson. By the time Jefferson moved in, more of the building was finished, and presumably he found better places to dry laundry. But for Abigail Adams, that first White House Christmas was defined not by trees or decorations or festive meals, but by the simple, unglamorous challenge of keeping her family's clothes clean and dry in a building that wasn't quite ready for anyone to live in it. And speaking of the White House slowly becoming more functional and modern, eventually they did figure out the whole indoor lighting situation. The White House didn't get electric Christmas lights until the 1890s. Picture this. It's 1895, and Grover Cleveland is starting his second term as president. He's the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, which is a weird bit of trivia that makes him both the 22nd and 24th president, depending on how you're counting. But more importantly for our purposes, he has young children who are absolutely fascinated by this new thing called electricity. and Christmas is coming. Now, electric Christmas lights had technically been invented a few years earlier. Edward Johnson, who worked for Thomas Edison, created the first string of electric Christmas lights in 1882, but they were expensive, complicated, and not exactly available at your local general store. Most Americans were still using candles on their Christmas trees, which again just seems like a terrible idea in retrospect, but was completely normal at the time. Grover Cleveland, however, had access to resources most Americans didn't, and his children, particularly his daughter Esther, who was the first and only child of a president born in the White House, were reportedly enchanted by the idea of lights that didn't involve fire. So Cleveland made the decision to have electric lights installed on the White House Christmas tree. This required actual professional electricians, custom wiring, and a generator situation that was probably more complicated than it needed to be. The lights themselves were small glass bulbs, nothing like the LED strings we have now. They were handmade, expensive, and sort of underwhelming compared to what we're used to. But at the time, they were absolutely magical. The tree was set up in the blue room, and when the lights were turned on, it was one of the first times most people had seen a Christmas tree illuminated with electricity rather than candles. The public reaction was fascinated, but also slightly terrified. Remember, electricity was still new and not well understood by most people. There were legitimate concerns about fire safety, even though electric lights were objectively safer than open flames on a dry tree. Some newspapers ran stories questioning whether this was a responsible use of new technology, whether the president was setting a dangerous precedent, and whether electric lights might somehow be harmful. It's almost endearing how suspicious people were about what was ultimately a much safer alternative to what they'd been doing. But Cleveland's children loved it, and that seemed to matter more to him than public opinion. He wasn't particularly interested in making grand statements about modernization or progress. He just wanted his kids to have a special Christmas. The fact that it happened to introduce many Americans to the concept of electric Christmas lights was almost incidental. Though, to be fair, it did help normalize the idea. When people saw that the president's family was using electric lights and not, electrocuting themselves or burning down the White House, it made the technology seem less scary and more accessible. The tradition didn't immediately catch on everywhere, though. Electric lights remained expensive and impractical for most American families for at least another decade or two. You needed access to electricity in the first place, which many rural homes didn't have. You needed to be able to afford the lights themselves, which were still being made by hand and cost significantly more than candles. And you needed to either understand electrical wiring yourself or hire someone who did, which added another layer of expense and complexity. So, for a while, electric Christmas lights were mostly a wealthy person's novelty, something you might see in a mansion or department store display, but not in most homes. Still, Cleveland had started something. The image of that first electrically lit White House Christmas tree stuck in people's minds. It represented progress and modernity and the future of American life. And gradually, as electricity became more widespread and the technology became cheaper, more families started making the switch. By the 1920s and 30s, electric Christmas lights were becoming genuinely common. But it all traced back to that 1895 decision by a president who just wanted to make his children smile. Though even with all this careful planning and new technology, things could still go wrong with White House Christmas trees. Staff once had to rescue the tree after it nearly fell over. Here's something you don't usually hear about in the polished, official White House Christmas photos. Sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes, despite everyone's best efforts and all the advanced planning, the massive Christmas tree in the blue room starts to tip over, and someone has to catch it before it crashes into priceless historical furniture and creates an international incident. This has happened more than once, actually. But there's one particular incident from the early 2000s that staff members still talk about in hushed, traumatized tones. The White House Christmas tree is not some modest tabletop decoration you could grab with one hand. It's typically an 18 to 20-foot Fraser fir that weighs several hundred pounds. Getting it into the Blue Room in the first place requires a whole team of people, careful measurement of doorways, and probably some physics calculations. The tree sits on a special stand that's designed to be stable and secure, but even with all those precautions, sometimes the distribution of ornaments isn't quite balanced, or the tree settles in the stand in a slightly wrong way, and suddenly you have a very expensive, very public problem developing. According to people who were there, the tree started leaning during the final stages of decoration. Not dramatically, not all at once, but just enough that someone noticed and quietly alerted the others. The chief usher, who is basically the person responsible for making sure the White House functions as both a home and a museum and doesn't fall apart, immediately assessed the situation and realized they had maybe 20 minutes before Physics 1 and the tree went over. They couldn't just let it fall. The Blue Room contains furniture that belonged to James Monroe. There were ornaments on the tree that had been made by children from every state, part of the annual tradition where the First Lady invites groups to contribute decorations. The press was scheduled to photograph the room later that day. This had to be fixed, and it had to be fixed invisibly. So, what followed was this quietly frantic operation, where several staff members, including electricians and members of the maintenance team, essentially had to unload part of the tree, readjust it in the stand, rebalance the weight distribution, and then put all the decorations back exactly as they had been. All of this while the First Lady's office was fielding questions about timing for the press event and trying to delay things without explaining why. Nobody could know that the official White House Christmas tree had almost eaten a federal antique chair. The whole thing got fixed in time. The photos that went out to the press showed a perfectly beautiful, perfectly stable tree, and no one outside the White House staff knew anything had gone wrong. But apparently, after that incident, they redesigned the tree stand and changed some of the protocols around weight distribution and ornament placement. They added more monitoring during the decoration process. They basically treated it like an engineering problem that needed solving, which it was. This is the thing about the White House that most people don't think about. Behind every perfect, polished photo and carefully choreographed event, there are dozens of people solving problems that no one's supposed to know about. The Christmas tree is supposed to look effortless and magical, and it does, but that's because an entire team of professionals is making sure nothing goes wrong. And on the rare occasions when something does start to go wrong, they fix it so quickly and quietly that the rest of us never know it happened. Which brings us to another president who had his own interesting relationship with White House Christmas traditions. Though his involved creating something new rather than preventing disaster, Calvin Coolidge accidentally started a permanent national tradition. So let's talk about Calvin Coolidge, who might be the most accidentally influential president when it comes to Christmas traditions. The year was 1923, and Coolidge had only been president for a few months. Warren G. Harding had died suddenly that August, and Coolidge, who had been vice president, was sworn in by his father, a notary public, in the middle of the night at their family home in Vermont. By kerosene lamp, no less, because they didn't have electricity yet. It was all very dramatic and old-fashioned, which is kind of perfect for Coolidge, who was not exactly known for being flashy or modern. Anyway, by December, Coolidge was settling into the presidency, and someone in the administration, history isn't entirely clear on who, came up with an idea. What if they put a Christmas tree on the Ellipse, the park south of the White House, and held a public lighting ceremony? It would be a nice gesture, something to bring people together during the holidays, and it would give the president a chance to address the nation in a less formal setting. The whole thing was supposed to be a one-time event, a single nice moment, nothing more. They got a 48-foot balsam fir from Vermont, Coolidge's home state, and set it up with 2,500 electric bulbs, which at the time was genuinely impressive. This wasn't just a tree with a few strings of lights. This was a spectacle. On Christmas Eve, 1923, 3,000 people gathered on the ellipse in the cold December evening to watch President Coolidge flip the switch. The tree lit up, a Marine band played carols, and Coolidge gave a short speech about peace and goodwill. The whole event was also broadcast on radio, which was still relatively new technology, meaning people across the country could listen to the ceremony from their homes. It was charming and wholesome, and exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from Silent Cal, who got that nickname because he was famously quiet and reserved, though apparently not so reserved that he wouldn't flip a giant light switch in front of 3,000 people. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The event was such a success that the next year people started asking, are we doing the tree again? And the year after that. And the year after that. What had been planned as a single special moment had accidentally become an annual expectation. Coolidge kept doing it throughout his presidency, probably because once you start a tradition like this, it's remarkably difficult to stop without looking like you're canceling Christmas. And then when Herbert Hoover became president, he continued the tradition. And then Franklin Roosevelt, and so on, all the way to the present day. But it wasn't always smooth sailing. During World War II, from 1941 to 1944, the tree lighting was suspended because of security concerns and wartime blackout restrictions. Having a giant, brightly lit tree visible from anywhere in the city seemed like maybe not the best idea when you were worried about potential attacks. Then, in 1954, there was no ceremony because it fell on a Sunday, and President Eisenhower felt it would be inappropriate. There have been other gaps and changes over the decades. Sometimes the location moved, sometimes the format changed. But the core tradition that Coolidge accidentally started in 1923 has persisted for over a century now. The modern version of the national Christmas tree lighting has become this enormous production with celebrity performers, elaborate staging, and television broadcasts. Tickets are distributed through a lottery system because so many people want to attend. The president still flips the switch to light the tree, though now it's more symbolic than functional. The actual electrical work is handled by professionals behind the scenes, and the switch the president touches is often not even connected to anything. It's all very carefully choreographed and planned months in advance. Multiple agencies are involved in security, logistics, and production. There are backup plans for bad weather, rehearsals, sound checks, the whole thing. Which is funny when you think about it, because Coolidge's original event in 1923 was relatively simple. They got a tree, put some lights on it, invited people to come watch, and that was basically it. There wasn't a huge amount of advanced planning or infrastructure. It was just a nice idea that someone had, and it happened to resonate with people in a way that nobody anticipated. Coolidge, being Coolidge, probably didn't think much of it at the time. He was a practical man who believed in small government and minimal fuss. The idea that his one-time Christmas tree lighting would still be happening 100 years later, requiring federal resources and multi-agency coordination, might have horrified him. Or maybe he would have found it quietly amusing. It's hard to say with Silent Cal, but the tradition endures, and every year when the current president lights the national Christmas tree, they're continuing something that Calvin Coolidge started accidentally on a cold December evening in 1923, probably without realizing he was creating a permanent fixture of American presidential Christmas celebrations. It's one of those historical moments that seems small at the time, but ends up mattering more than anyone expected. And that tree in Vermont that they cut down for the first ceremony, it's long gone, obviously, but Vermont still provides the national Christmas tree periodically. a reminder of the whole thing's somewhat random origin. Though Coolidge wasn't the only president finding new ways to spread Christmas cheer from the White House, Woodrow Wilson was the first president to send official White House Christmas cards. Before Woodrow Wilson, presidents might have sent personal Christmas greetings to friends and family, but there was no official tradition of the president sending Christmas cards to hundreds or thousands of people on behalf of the White House itself. Wilson changed that in 1913, his first year in office, though the decision wasn't entirely his own. His wife, Ellen Wilson, actually seems to have been the driving force behind the idea, which makes sense because the First Lady typically handles these sorts of social traditions and protocols. Ellen thought it would be a gracious gesture to send holiday greetings to diplomatic contacts, government officials, and others who had some connection to the administration. The first official White House Christmas cards were relatively simple by modern standards. They weren't elaborate, multi-panel productions with photos and gold foil and die-cut designs. They were dignified, formal cards with a printed message of seasonal greetings and the president's name. Ellen Wilson worked with an artist to design something that felt appropriately presidential, elegant but not ostentatious, warm but not overly personal. The cards went out to a carefully curated list of recipients, probably a few hundred people at most. It was a small gesture, really, just a way of acknowledging relationships and wishing people well during the holidays. But like many small gestures, it established a precedent. The following year, Ellen Wilson had died. She passed away in August of 1914 from kidney disease, and Woodrow Wilson was navigating both personal grief and the early stages of World War I in Europe. The Christmas card tradition could have easily been dropped in all that chaos, but Wilson continued it, possibly because maintaining the tradition felt like honoring his late wife's vision, or possibly because the State Department and White House staff recognized that these cards served a diplomatic function. Sending holiday greetings to foreign ambassadors and government officials wasn't just polite. It was a low-key way of maintaining relationships and demonstrating American goodwill during a very tense period in world history. After Wilson married Edith Gall in 1915, his second wife, the Christmas card tradition continued and gradually expanded. Edith had her own ideas about White House entertaining and social protocols, and she embraced the Christmas card project enthusiastically. The list of recipients grew, the designs became slightly more elaborate, and other presidents who came after Wilson picked up the tradition and made it their own. Each administration puts its own stamp on the cards. Different artistic styles, different messages, sometimes photos of the first family or the White House itself, sometimes more abstract seasonal imagery. By the middle of the 20th century, the White House Christmas card had become a significant undertaking. We're not talking about a few hundred cards anymore. We're talking about tens of thousands. The list of recipients includes not just diplomatic contacts and government officials, but also campaign supporters, members of Congress, White House staff, members of the press corps, and various other individuals who have some connection to the administration. Creating, printing, signing, addressing, and mailing this many cards requires serious logistics. There's an entire process that starts months before Christmas, with decisions about design and printing, and continues through weeks of signing sessions where the president and first lady sit down with stacks of cards and add their signatures. Sometimes they sign their full names, sometimes just initials. It depends on how many thousands of cards we're talking about. And yes, the signatures are real. Despite what some people assume, these aren't auto-signed or stamped. The president and first lady actually sit there and sign these things, usually while watching TV or listening to music or having conversations with staff. It's one of those odd tasks that comes with the job, turning the presidential schedule into something that includes multiple card signing sessions in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Some presidents reportedly enjoyed this quiet, repetitive task. It was a break from the usual intensity of the job. Others found it tedious but accepted it as part of the role. The designs themselves have ranged from traditional to contemporary, from religious imagery to secular winter scenes. Some first ladies have used artwork created by their children. Jackie Kennedy famously commissioned designs from artists. Nancy Reagan preferred elegant, classic designs. Michelle Obama often featured images of the family dog, Bo. Each card reflects not just the personal taste of the first family, but also the broader cultural and political context of the time. During wartime, the cards tend to be more subdued. During times of prosperity and peace, they can be more exuberant. It's a small detail, but it's one of those things that historians actually pay attention to when studying presidential administrations. What started with Ellen Wilson's gracious impulse in 1913 has become this massive, complex operation that engages staff from multiple White House offices, requires advanced planning and budgeting, and generates considerable public interest. People collect presidential Christmas cards. They save them as historical artifacts. There are entire collections in presidential libraries and museums. Something that began as a simple courtesy has transformed into a tradition with cultural significance, all because Woodrow Wilson's first wife thought it would be nice to send some holiday greetings. And speaking of White House traditions shaped by personal circumstances, FDR designed the Christmas tree layout to accommodate his wheelchair. Franklin Delano Roosevelt contracted polio in 1921 when he was 39 years old, and it left him paralyzed from the waist down. He could stand with leg braces and significant support, but mostly he used a wheelchair, though the full extent of his disability was carefully hidden from the public through a combination of strategic photography, cooperative press coverage, and FDR's own determination to project strength and vigor. By the time he became president in 1933, he had spent over a decade figuring out how to navigate spaces that weren't designed for wheelchair users, which was basically every space because accessibility wasn't something people thought much about in the 1930s. So when it came time to set up the White House Christmas tree, and Roosevelt loved Christmas, by the way, he went all in on the decorations and the festivities. He had to think about things that most presidents never considered. How do you position a tree so that someone in a wheelchair can actually see it properly? How do you arrange the ornaments so they're visible from a seated position? How do you set up the surrounding furniture and decorations so there's enough clearance to navigate the space? These weren't theoretical questions for Roosevelt. They were practical problems that needed solving. The solution he developed was actually pretty clever. Instead of placing the tree in a corner or against a wall, which was traditional, Roosevelt had it positioned more centrally in the room with open space around it. This allowed him to wheel around the tree and see it from different angles. The ornaments were arranged with attention to height. More decorations in the middle and lower portions of the tree where they'd be visible from a wheelchair, fewer at the very top. The furniture in the room was spaced to allow for wheelchair access without making it obvious that this was the reason for the arrangement. To anyone else, the layout just looked spacious and elegant. To Roosevelt, it was functional and accessible. He also changed some of the protocols around the tree lighting ceremony. Traditionally, the president might stand next to the tree while the lights were turned on, often by reaching up to flip a switch or touch the tree itself in some ceremonial way. Roosevelt modified this so he could participate meaningfully from his wheelchair. Sometimes the switch was positioned lower. Sometimes the ceremony was structured so he could be seated in a specific position where he'd be framed well by the tree and the lights. The whole thing was choreographed to work with his disability rather than despite it. What's remarkable is how invisible these adaptations were to most people at the time. The press didn't write about FDR designing the Christmas tree layout for wheelchair accessibility because the press had an unspoken agreement not to emphasize the president's disability. Photographs from White House Christmas events during the Roosevelt years show him seated, but not in ways that draw attention to the wheelchair. He's usually positioned behind a desk or in an armchair, surrounded by family members or with the Christmas tree artfully placed in the background. The accommodations he made were there, but they weren't discussed. This is interesting from a modern perspective because now we think about accessibility as something that should be visible and normalized. We have laws requiring it. We mark accessible entrances and parking spaces. We talk openly about disability and accommodation. But in Roosevelt's era, the whole strategy was discretion. He made the spaces work for him without announcing that he was doing so. And the thing is, his modifications probably made the White House Christmas setup better for everyone. Having more space around the tree, having decorations at multiple heights, having flexible furniture arrangements, these things improved the functionality of the space regardless of whether someone was using a wheelchair. Roosevelt hosted multiple large Christmas gatherings at the White House during his 12 years in office. He had children and grandchildren visit. He held parties for staff and their families. The Christmas tree was always a central feature, and the careful thought he put into its placement and decoration meant that everyone could enjoy it comfortably. He created traditions around reading a Christmas carol aloud to the family on Christmas Eve. He made sure there were presents for all the children who visited, often choosing them himself. The man genuinely loved Christmas, and his disability didn't diminish that. It just meant he had to be more thoughtful about the logistics. There's something quietly profound about this. Roosevelt was dealing with the Great Depression, then World War II, enormous crises that defined his presidency and changed American history. But he still took the time to think about where to put the Christmas tree so he could see it properly. He still made sure the White House felt festive and welcoming during the holidays, even when the world was falling apart outside. It was a small act of normalcy and joy in the midst of chaos, and the accommodations he made for his own access ended up creating a better experience for everyone who visited. And all of those carefully chosen decorations that made Roosevelt's trees so special had to be stored somewhere. The White House has a secret Christmas closet. All right, so here's something that makes perfect sense once you think about it, but somehow never occurs to most people. The White House has an absolutely massive collection of Christmas decorations, and all of it has to be stored somewhere. We're not talking about a few boxes of ornaments shoved in an attic. We're talking about decades worth of accumulated decorations, lights, garlands, wreaths, tree toppers, specialized display pieces, historically significant ornaments, and various other items that have been acquired, donated, or commissioned over the years. And yes, there is literally a designated storage space for all of this, which White House staff sometimes informally refer to as the Christmas closet, though it's more accurately a climate-controlled storage room in the building's lower levels. The existence of this storage space isn't exactly classified information, but it's not something the White House tends to publicize either. It's just one of those behind-the-scenes details that doesn't make it into the official tour or the press releases. But if you talk to people who've worked in the White House residence, the ushers, the florists, the housekeeping staff, they all know about it. They're the ones who have to access it every year when it's time to start decorating for Christmas. And they're the ones who have to carefully inventory and pack everything away again after the holidays. The collection is organized because it has to be. There are sections for different types of decorations, ornaments grouped by theme or era, lights separated by color and bulb type, garlands categorized by style. There are boxes labeled with information about which First Lady acquired or commissioned particular items, because this matters when making decisions about what to display. Some decorations are considered historically significant and are handled with archival care. Others are more utilitarian and get used regularly. There are ornaments that were made by school children and donated to the White House over the years, hundreds and hundreds of them, each one representing a small connection between the presidency and ordinary American families. Some of the items in the Christmas closet are genuinely old. There are ornaments that date back to the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, even earlier in some cases. These aren't necessarily on display every year. First ladies typically choose a theme and select decorations that fit that theme, but they're preserved and available. There are also more recent additions, things acquired or commissioned by more recent administrations. The collection keeps growing because each First Lady tends to add to it, commissioning new ornaments or display pieces that reflect her personal taste or the specific theme she's chosen for that year. The logistics of storing all this stuff are actually kind of complicated. Christmas decorations are surprisingly fragile. Glass ornaments break, lights degrade, garlands shed. Everything needs to be packed carefully in protective materials, labeled clearly, and stored in conditions that won't cause damage. Temperature and humidity have to be controlled because otherwise you get problems with warping, fading, or deterioration. It's not dramatically different from how a museum stores its collection, which makes sense because, in many ways, the White House is a museum that people happen to live in. And then every year, around late October or early November, the process of pulling everything out begins. The head florist and the chief usher work with the First Lady's office to determine what the theme will be and which decorations will be used. Teams of people go through the storage room, pulling out the selected items, checking them for damage, replacing broken bulbs, and generally making sure everything is in good condition. Some years this is relatively straightforward because the chosen theme works with existing inventory. Other years it requires supplementing with new purchases or commissioned pieces, which means the collection continues to grow. There's something slightly surreal about imagining this room full of Christmas decorations just sitting there in the White House year round. Like in July, when everyone's thinking about summer and fireworks and barbecues, there's this climate controlled storage space somewhere in the building containing thousands of ornaments and miles of garland and multiple sets of tree lights, all waiting patiently for December to roll around again. It's such a specific, odd detail, but it's also kind of wonderful. The White House maintains this enormous collection because Christmas matters, because the decorations are part of creating a sense of occasion and celebration, and because there's genuine historical value in preserving these objects that connect current administrations to previous ones. The Christmas closet is a small but telling example of how the White House functions. For every public facing moment, the tree lighting, the press tours, the formal photos, there's an infrastructure of planning and preservation happening behind the scenes. Nothing just spontaneously appears. Everything is intentional, maintained, and stored properly, so it can be used again. And the fact that they've been building this collection for decades means that each year's decorations exist in conversation with all the years that came before, creating continuity across administrations and reminding everyone that the White House is bigger than any single family or president who temporarily lives there. And speaking of decisions about which decorations to use and how to present them, the First Lady secretly chooses a new Christmas theme every year. So here's how this works. Every year, usually starting in late summer or early fall, the First Lady sits down with the White House chief usher, the head florist, and usually a few other key staff members, and they start planning the Christmas decorations. And the very first question that gets discussed is, what's the theme going to be? Because unlike a normal household where you might just put up the same decorations every year without thinking too much about it, the White House approaches Christmas decorations the way a museum approaches a new exhibition. There's a concept, a cohesive vision, a story being told through the decoration choices. This tradition of having a formal theme for the White House Christmas decorations was essentially started by Jackie Kennedy in 1961. Before that, the decorations were certainly nice and thoughtful, but there wasn't necessarily an overarching concept tying everything together. Jackie, being Jackie, decided that the decorations should tell a story, and She chose the Nutcracker as her theme that first year. The Blue Room tree was decorated with ornaments and figures representing characters from the ballet: toy soldiers, mice, snowflakes, the Nutcracker himself. It was cohesive, artistic, and it transformed the space into something more intentional than just nice holiday decorations. And once Jackie Kennedy did it, it became expected. Every subsequent First Lady has chosen a theme, and the theme matters quite a bit. It sets the tone for the entire decorating scheme throughout the White House. Not just the main tree in the Blue Room, but all the smaller trees, the garlands, the wreaths, the table decorations, everything. Some First Ladies have chosen traditional themes focused on American history or patriotism. Others have gone with literary themes, nature themes, or concepts around hope and peace. Laura Bush did a Winter Wonderland theme one year and a Deck the Halls and Welcome All theme another year. Michelle Obama's themes included Gather Around Stories of the Season and The Gift of the Holidays. Melania Trump did American Treasures and Time-Honored Traditions. Each choice reflects the First Lady's personal interests and priorities while also being appropriate for the setting. The interesting thing is how much thought goes into this decision. The theme has to be broad enough to work across multiple rooms and decoration types, but specific enough to feel cohesive. It has to be something that can be communicated to the public, because the White House does release information about the theme when they do the press tours, but it also has to be something that won't be politically controversial, which is harder than it sounds. It needs to work with the existing collection of decorations in the Christmas closet, or there needs to be a plan for acquiring or commissioning new pieces. And it all has to come together on a tight timeline because the decorating happens over just a few days, usually right after Thanksgiving. And it needs to be perfect when the press is invited in to photograph it. The actual selection of the theme is technically secret until the White House announces it, though in practice, various people involved in the planning obviously know what's happening. The florists know, the design team knows, the volunteers who come in to help with decorating are told what the theme is so they can work appropriately. But the public doesn't find out until the White House is ready to reveal it, usually when they do the media preview of the decorations. This allows for a bit of surprise and anticipation, which the White House communications team generally likes because it creates a positive news story during the holidays. Some themes are more elaborate than others. When there's a literary theme, the staff might incorporate quotes or design elements from specific books. When the theme is about American heritage, they might include ornaments representing different states or historical moments. One year, the theme centered around children's artwork, and the decorations incorporated thousands of drawings and ornaments made by kids from across the country. The level of detail can be extraordinary, down to the specific ribbons used on wreaths, the colors of the lights, the types of flowers in the arrangements. Everything is intentional. And here's the thing that's kind of beautiful about this. The First Lady doesn't have to do any of this. There's no law or formal requirement that says she needs to spend time thinking about Christmas themes and decoration schemes. She could theoretically just tell the staff to put up some nice decorations and call it a day. But every First Lady since Jackie Kennedy has engaged with this tradition, putting her own stamp on the White House Christmas while respecting the traditions that came before. It's one of those roles that comes with being First Lady that isn't in any official job description, but has become an expected part of the position anyway. The themes also serve a kind of time capsule function. Years later, when people look back at a particular administration, the Christmas themes that First Lady chose tell you something about her priorities and her vision for what the White House should represent. It's soft power, in a way, using aesthetic choices and seasonal traditions to communicate values and create connections with the American public. And it all starts with a private conversation in late summer when the First Lady and her team sit down and ask themselves, what story do we want to tell this Christmas? The White House gingerbread house began as a modest treat. Let's talk about the White House gingerbread house, which has become this absolutely massive tradition that takes weeks to construct and uses hundreds of pounds of ingredients. But it didn't start out that way, not even close. The whole thing began in 1969 during the Nixon administration, and the original gingerbread house was, well, it was a house, a small one, something you could actually imagine eating, which is supposedly the point of gingerbread, though at some point along the way, everyone forgot that. The White House pastry chef at the time was a man named Hans Raffert, and he had this idea to make a gingerbread house as a Christmas decoration for the state dining room, not as the centerpiece of the entire holiday display, just as a nice, festive touch. A charming detail that visitors might notice and appreciate. So he baked some gingerbread, constructed a modest little house, decorated it with royal icing and some candy details, and set it up on a side table. It was cute. It was appropriately seasonal, and that could have been the end of it. A one-time decoration that got disassembled after Christmas and never thought about again. But Pat Nixon, the First Lady, apparently loved it. She thought it added a warm, homey element to the state dining room, which can otherwise feel quite formal and intimidating with its portrait of Abraham Lincoln looming over everything. So the next year, Raffert made another gingerbread house, and the year after that. And gradually, without anyone explicitly deciding this, it became a tradition. Each year's gingerbread house was a bit more elaborate than the last. What started as a simple structure with basic icing decoration evolved into increasingly detailed architectural miniatures, with windows and doors and tiny landscaping features made from various candies and edible decorations. By the 1980s and 90s, the gingerbread house had become genuinely impressive. The pastry chefs, because at this point it wasn't just one person anymore, it was a team effort, started creating versions that accurately represented the White House itself, complete with the north portico, the columns, the windows in their correct positions, even tiny wreaths on the doors. They were working from architectural plans to get the proportions right. The houses were getting bigger, more detailed, more technically complex. And somewhere along the way, they stopped being something you could realistically imagine eating and became more like edible sculptures or architectural models that happened to be made from gingerbread. The modern White House gingerbread house is genuinely absurd in the best possible way. We're talking about a structure that can weigh over 300 pounds and use hundreds of pounds of gingerbread dough, dozens of pounds of chocolate, and gallons of royal icing. It takes the pastry team weeks to construct, working in stages because you can't just bake and assemble something this large all at once. The gingerbread needs to be baked in sections, and each section needs to cool and harden properly before it can be assembled. The royal icing that holds everything together needs time to set. The decorative elements, and there are thousands of them, need to be attached carefully and precisely. Recent versions have included not just the White House itself, but also the surrounding grounds, with gingerbread and marzipan trees, candy pathways, chocolate fencing, and sometimes even tiny gingerbread figures representing staff or the first family's pets. One year, they made a gingerbread replica of the White House kitchen garden that Michelle Obama had established. Another year, they included miniature versions of the solar panels that had been installed on the roof. The level of detail is frankly unnecessary, but that's part of what makes it wonderful. Nobody asked for gingerbread solar panels, but someone decided they should exist anyway. The whole project has this interesting tension between food and art. Technically, all the materials used in the gingerbread house are edible. The gingerbread is real gingerbread, baked using an actual recipe. The icing is actual royal icing. The decorative elements are candies and chocolates and other edible items. But nobody's eating this thing. It sits in the state dining room for the entire holiday season, getting photographed thousands of times, And then after Christmas, it gets carefully disassembled. And honestly, I'm not entirely sure what happens to it. Presumably, it gets thrown away because month old gingerbread that's been sitting out in a warm room doesn't sound particularly appetizing. Though I suppose some of the more durable components might get saved and reused as reference models for the next year. The pastry chefs who work on this project take it extremely seriously. There are sketches and planning sessions. They test structural techniques to make sure nothing collapses. They problem solve issues with weight distribution and architectural integrity. It's genuinely impressive craftsmanship, and the fact that it's all made from ingredients you could theoretically eat makes it even more remarkable. These are professional pastry chefs with serious culinary training, and they're using those skills to construct what is essentially a very detailed, very fragile, very delicious smelling architectural model. And every year, when the White House does its holiday press preview, the gingerbread house is one of the main attractions. Photographers take pictures of it from every angle. Journalists write articles about how many pounds of gingerbread were used and how long it took to make. The White House social media accounts post close up photos of specific details. Look at the tiny wreath on this door. Look at the chocolate stone texture on the walls. It's become as much a part of the White House Christmas tradition as the main tree in the Blue Room, which is kind of amazing when you remember that it started as Hans Raffert making a small, simple gingerbread house to decorate a side table in 1969. The whole evolution of the gingerbread house tradition is very American in a way. We took something modest and charming and, over the course of several decades, transformed it into something elaborate and excessive and spectacular. And somehow it works. The White House gingerbread house is delightful precisely because it's so over the top. Nobody needs a 300-pound replica of the White House made entirely from gingerbread and icing, but we have one anyway, and it makes people smile when they see it, which, in the end, is probably the whole point of Christmas decorations in the first place. Though the gingerbread house is a relatively recent tradition compared to some of the older White House Christmas customs, there used to be Christmas open houses anyone could attend. Imagine this. It's the mid 1800s, and you're just a regular person living in Washington, D.C., or maybe visiting from out of town. Christmas is coming up, and you think to yourself, you know what? I'd like to wish the president a Merry Christmas. So you just go to the White House. You walk up to the front door, and they let you in. You wait in line with a bunch of other people. You shake the president's hand. You exchange pleasantries. Maybe you grab some refreshments, and then you leave. No invitation required. No security screening. No background check or advance registration. You just showed up, and that was fine. This actually happened. For decades in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the White House held open houses during the holidays where any citizen could come and meet the president. The most famous of these was the New Year's Day reception, but Christmas gatherings happened too, though they were usually slightly smaller and less formal. The tradition dated back to the early days of the Republic, based on the idea that the president was a public servant who should be accessible to ordinary citizens. It was very democratic and egalitarian, and also, in hindsight, completely terrifying from a security standpoint. The open houses were genuinely open. You didn't need a ticket or a special pass. You didn't need to be wealthy or connected or politically important. You just needed to show up during the designated hours, wait your turn in line, and eventually you'd get your few seconds with the president. Some people came in their finest clothes, treating it as a grand social occasion. Others came in their regular work attire because they'd heard the president was receiving visitors and wanted to participate. There are accounts of farmers showing up in their muddy boots, workers coming directly from their jobs, families bringing their children to meet the president. It was genuinely open to everyone. For the presidents, these events were exhausting. Andrew Jackson's 1835 open house reportedly drew 20,000 people, and the crowd got so unruly that Jackson had to escape through a back entrance, while servants lured the mob outside by placing tubs of whiskey-spiked punch on the White House lawn. That's not exactly a Christmas story, but it illustrates the chaos that these open events could generate. Even more orderly receptions meant standing for hours, shaking hundreds or thousands of hands until your arm went numb and your face hurt from smiling. William Howard Taft reportedly shook hands with nearly 6,000 people during a single New Year's Day reception, which sounds like some sort of endurance challenge more than a social event. But the tradition persisted because it was considered important symbolically. The president wasn't supposed to be some distant monarch isolated from the people. This was America, and Americans should be able to walk up and meet their president, even if just for a brief moment. The handshake became this ritual of democratic access, a physical connection between citizen and leader. First ladies participated too, standing beside their husbands for hours, greeting guests, making small talk, trying to make each person feel welcomed and acknowledged, even though there were hundreds more people waiting behind them. The logistics of these events were actually fairly elaborate. The White House staff would prepare refreshments, punch, cakes, cookies, various treats, which guests could enjoy after they made their way through the receiving line. The public rooms would be decorated festively. Sometimes there was music, usually a military band playing seasonal songs or patriotic tunes. The whole thing had to be planned and executed by a relatively small staff who were also responsible for maintaining the building and serving the first family's regular needs. It was a lot of work, and the aftermath, the cleanup, the damage repair, the replacement of broken items was even more work. By the early 20th century, though, the tradition was becoming increasingly problematic. The White House was getting more crowded. Security concerns were growing, especially after the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901. The crowds at open houses were becoming unmanageable. And frankly, the events had lost some of their original democratic character. They'd become social obligations that wealthy Washingtonians attended out of habit, mixed with tourists who came for the novelty, and the whole thing was less about genuine citizen access and more about maintaining a tradition that no longer served its original purpose. The final blow came during World War I. Security concerns and wartime restrictions made the open houses impractical and potentially dangerous. President Wilson suspended the tradition, and it was never really resumed in its original form. There were occasional attempts to revive scaled-down versions, but the era of just showing up at the White House and walking in to shake the president's hand was over. The building became increasingly secure and controlled. Access became restricted and regulated. You couldn't just wander in anymore, which makes sense, obviously. Modern security requirements mean the president can't have thousands of unvetted people flowing through the White House whenever they feel like it. But there's something lost too, isn't there? That direct physical accessibility, the idea that any citizen could walk up and personally greet the president during the holidays, was a powerful symbol of American democracy. It suggested that the president was, fundamentally, just another citizen, temporarily serving in a role but not separate from or above the people. The end of the open houses marked a shift toward a more protected, more distant presidency, which was probably necessary but also changed something fundamental about the relationship between Americans and their president. Though even with restricted access, the White House staff still had to manage holiday events carefully. Secret Service adjusts the Christmas tree lighting every year. Here's something that seems simple but is actually surprisingly complex. The president flipping the switch to light the national Christmas tree. You've probably seen videos or photos of this moment. The president standing there reaching out to touch a button or pull a lever, and suddenly the tree lights up while thousands of people cheer. It looks spontaneous and magical, like the president is personally completing an electrical circuit and bringing light to the darkness. Except that's not really what's happening. The actual electrical work is handled by professionals, and the switch the president touches is often not connected to anything at all. The whole thing is carefully choreographed theater, and the Secret Service is deeply involved in making sure it goes smoothly. The security concerns around the national Christmas tree lighting are more complicated than you might think. You've got the president standing in an outdoor public space with thousands of people around. You've got elaborate electrical equipment and lighting systems that could potentially malfunction. You've got the logistics of timing. The event is usually broadcast live, so delays or technical problems are very visible. And you've got the simple fact that nothing involving the president happens spontaneously. Everything is planned, rehearsed, and secured in advance. So, what actually happens is this. Weeks before the event, the Secret Service works with the National Park Service, the electrical contractors, and various other agencies to plan the exact setup. They determine where the president will stand, where the switch will be positioned, how the lighting sequence will work, and what the backup plans are if something goes wrong. The actual electrical connections are tested repeatedly. The timing is rehearsed. And on the day of the event, there are usually multiple redundant systems in place, so that if one component fails, the lights will still come on when they're supposed to. The switch the president touches is essentially ceremonial. It might send a signal to a control system, or it might do absolutely nothing, and the lights are actually triggered by someone else at a control panel who's watching the president and waiting for the right moment. Either way, the president isn't personally completing an electrical circuit. That would be absurdly dangerous and unreliable. Instead, they're participating in a ritual where their symbolic action corresponds with the actual technical action happening behind the scenes. It's like how the president signs bills into law. The signature matters legally, but the actual implementation involves thousands of people doing complicated work that has nothing to do with putting pen to paper. The Secret Service also worries about things most people never consider. What if someone's trying to disrupt the event? What if there's a threat called in? What if the weather suddenly turns dangerous? What if the president trips or has some sort of medical issue? They have contingency plans for all of these scenarios. There are agents positioned throughout the crowd. There are snipers on nearby buildings, though they try to keep them out of sight because people get understandably uncomfortable when they notice armed agents watching from rooftops. There are emergency medical personnel standing by. There are evacuation routes planned. The whole thing is a massive security operation disguised as a cheerful holiday event. And then there's the timing aspect, which is its own kind of challenge. The event is usually scheduled for a specific time in the evening when it will be dark enough for the lights to be impressive, but not so late that it's inconvenient for families with young children. But December weather is unpredictable. Sometimes it's clear and perfect. Sometimes it's raining or snowing. Sometimes it's so cold that the president's speech needs to be shortened because no one can stand outside comfortably for very long. The Secret Service has to plan for all of these possibilities while also maintaining the appearance that everything is going exactly as intended. There's also the question of what happens if the lights don't come on. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps the technical crew awake at night. The president reaches out, touches the switch, and nothing. Dead silence. Awkward darkness. Thousands of people staring at a dark tree while the president stands there looking confused. So they build in redundancy, multiple power sources, multiple control systems, backup lights in case the primary ones fail. And if absolutely everything goes wrong, there's probably someone with a manual override who can get at least some lights working, even if it means abandoning the fancy synchronized sequence. The interesting thing is that all of this careful planning and security work is designed to be invisible. The goal is to make the tree lighting look effortless and spontaneous, even though it's neither of those things. The president is supposed to seem like they're just reaching out and making something magical happen, not like they're participating in a carefully scripted security protocol that's been planned for weeks. And most years, it works. The president touches the switch, the tree lights up exactly on cue, the crowd cheers, and everyone goes home happy, never knowing about the Secret Service agents, the backup systems, the contingency plans, and the ceremonial nature of the switch itself. It's one of those things where the performance is more important than the reality. We want to believe that the president can just flip a switch and light up a giant Christmas tree. So we've created an elaborate system that makes that belief feel real, even though the actual mechanics are far more complicated and involve dozens of people working behind the scenes, which honestly is kind of a perfect metaphor for the presidency in general. Though not all presidential Christmas moments were quite so carefully planned. There was once a real live Christmas zoo on the South Lawn. Benjamin Harrison shows up again in this story, and honestly, he deserves credit for running what might have been the most chaotic White House Christmas situation in history. We've already talked about how he brought the first indoor Christmas tree to the White House in 1889. But that wasn't the only unusual thing happening during the Harrison family's holiday celebrations. Because at various points during his presidency, the South Lawn of the White House featured what can only be described as a menagerie of exotic animals that had been sent to the president as gifts. And during Christmas of 1889, Harrison's grandchildren, the same ones who inspired the indoor Christmas tree, basically had access to their own personal zoo. Here's how this happened. In the 19th century, it was not unusual for foreign dignitaries or American admirers to send animals to the president as gifts. There was no established protocol for declining these gifts, and there certainly wasn't a modern understanding of why keeping exotic animals in inappropriate environments might be problematic. So presidents just kept the animals, or tried to. Jefferson had a mockingbird and a pair of grizzly bear cubs. Coolidge had a pygmy hippo. But Harrison's collection during his presidency was particularly extensive and particularly weird. The animals included at various times an opossum, a Mexican double yellow-headed parrot, and most famously a goat named his Whiskers, who pulled the Harrison grandchildren around the White House grounds in a cart. His Whiskers was apparently quite energetic and not particularly obedient. There's a famous story about the goat escaping the White House grounds with the children still in the cart, forcing President Harrison to chase after them down Pennsylvania Avenue in his formal attire. Can you imagine? The President of the United States running down the street, trying to catch a runaway goat that's pulling his grandchildren in a cart. The whole scene was reportedly witnessed by various Washington residents who found it extremely entertaining. But the menagerie wasn't just for entertainment. During the Christmas season of 1889, when the Harrison grandchildren were staying at the White House, the South Lawn effectively became their private Christmas zoo. The animals were housed in various enclosures and structures, and the children would visit them as part of their holiday activities. For them, Christmas at Grandpa's house meant not just a decorated tree and presents, but also getting to interact with exotic animals that most American children would never see outside of a traveling circus. Now, from a modern perspective, this sounds like a recipe for disaster. We're talking about animals that weren't being cared for by trained zoologists or veterinarians, living in enclosures that weren't designed for their specific needs, in a climate that probably wasn't appropriate for some of them. There was no real oversight or regulation. No one was checking whether these animals were healthy or whether keeping them was ethical or safe. It was just happening because people thought it was interesting and nobody knew any better. The situation with his Whiskers the goat actually illustrates some of these problems. Goats need proper fencing and supervision, especially when they're being used to pull children in carts. The fact that his Whiskers escaped suggests that the setup wasn't adequate. And while the story of the president chasing a goat down Pennsylvania Avenue is funny, it's also a reminder that having a bunch of animals living on the White House grounds without proper facilities or trained handlers was inherently chaotic and potentially dangerous. Eventually, most of these animals were either given away, sent to actual zoos, or died and weren't replaced. The practice of accepting exotic animals as gifts continued for a few more decades. Coolidge's pygmy hippo didn't arrive until the 1920s, but over time, protocols were established. Now, when foreign dignitaries give animals to the president, they're typically transferred immediately to the National Zoo or another appropriate facility. The president might visit them and pose for photos, but the animals don't live at the White House. We've collectively realized that the White House is not an appropriate environment for maintaining a collection of exotic animals, even if presidential grandchildren think it would be fun to have a Christmas zoo on the South Lawn. But the Harrison Christmas of 1889 remains this fascinating snapshot of a different era, when the White House was less formal and regulated, when people had different ideas about animals and appropriate gifts, and when presidential grandchildren could genuinely spend their Christmas vacation hanging out with an opossum and a parrot and a badly behaved goat named His Whiskers. It was chaotic and probably not great for the animals, but it was also undeniably memorable. Though Benjamin Harrison's grandchildren weren't the only ones to experience an unusual White House Christmas tradition. The White House once had a Christmas tree decorated with toys for charity. There's a particular kind of Christmas tradition that's designed to look generous but actually requires careful thought about how to implement it without creating problems. And the White House learned this lesson the hard way with what seemed like a simple, lovely idea. What if they decorated the Christmas tree with toys, and then after the holidays, gave those toys to children who needed them? It sounds perfect, right? Festive decorations that serve a charitable purpose, helping children while also creating a beautiful display. What could possibly go wrong? This tradition began in the early 20th century, probably during the Theodore Roosevelt or William Howard Taft administrations, though the exact origins are a bit unclear. The concept was straightforward. Instead of decorating the White House Christmas tree only with ornaments and lights, they would hang toys, dolls, small games, wooden soldiers, that sort of thing, which would serve as decorations throughout the holiday season. Then after Christmas, the toys would be taken down and donated to orphanages or given to families in need. It combined the aesthetic appeal of a decorated tree with the charitable impulse of helping children who wouldn't otherwise have much of a Christmas. In practice, the tradition worked reasonably well for several years. The toys were chosen carefully to be both decorative and appropriate for donation. They were hung securely on the tree branches. At the end of the holiday season, staff would carefully remove them, make sure they were clean and undamaged, and distribute them through established charitable channels, usually working with local organizations that had relationships with families in need. The children who received these toys were getting items that had been displayed in the White House, which added a kind of special significance to the gifts. It was a nice tradition that made people feel good about the holidays, but there were problems that became apparent over time. First, not all toys are equally suitable for both decoration and donation. Something that looks beautiful hanging on a tree, a delicate doll with elaborate clothing, for instance, might not be practical for a child who needs a sturdy toy they can actually play with. Conversely, toys that are practical and durable don't necessarily make the most attractive tree decorations. So there was always this tension between the aesthetic goals and the charitable goals. Second, there was the issue of condition. Even though the toys were handled carefully, spending several weeks hanging on a Christmas tree isn't great for them. They'd accumulate dust. The ribbons or strings used to attach them to branches might leave marks. The heat from nearby lights, because remember, early electric Christmas lights got quite hot, could cause warping or fading. By the time the toys were removed from the tree, some of them weren't in the best condition for gifting to children. Nobody wanted to give a child a toy that looked worn or damaged, but that's sometimes what happened. Third, and this is perhaps the most significant issue, there was something a bit uncomfortable about the whole setup. The toys were essentially being used as decorations first and charity items second. They were serving the White House's aesthetic and publicity needs before they served any charitable purpose. And while the intentions were good, there was a kind of awkwardness to the fact that these items intended for children in need were first displayed for wealthy guests and diplomats at White House Christmas parties. It created a weird dynamic where the needs of poor children were being used, in a sense, as decoration. The tradition gradually faded out, probably by the 1930s or 40s, though again, the exact timeline is unclear. It wasn't that anyone made a formal decision to end it. It just quietly stopped happening as first ladies and White House staff moved toward other decorating schemes and other ways of incorporating charity into White House holiday traditions. Instead of using toys as decorations, they might collect unwrapped toys separately and donate them. Or they'd focus on other charitable activities that didn't involve this complicated intersection of decoration and donation. Modern White House Christmas traditions still involve charity, but they're structured differently. First ladies often highlight specific charitable causes during the holidays. They might host events for military families or children from local organizations. They might encourage Americans to volunteer or donate to various causes. But the Toys on the Tree tradition, with all its complications and awkward implications, has been relegated to history. It's an interesting example of how traditions evolve and change as we think more carefully about their implications. What seemed like a lovely, generous idea at the time, using Christmas decorations for a charitable purpose, turned out to have some problems in practice. And rather than trying to fix those problems, the White House quietly moved on to other approaches. Sometimes the best way to handle a well intentioned but flawed tradition is just to let it fade away and replace it with something better. Though charity concerns weren't the only reason White House Christmas decorations changed over the years. During wartime, the White House often dimmed its decorations. War changes everything, including Christmas. And one of the quieter, less dramatic ways that war affected American life was through the dimming or complete elimination of White House holiday decorations during periods of conflict. This happened multiple times throughout the 20th century, and each time it reflected not just practical security concerns, but also a sense of appropriateness, a feeling that elaborate celebrations didn't feel right when American soldiers were dying overseas. The first significant instance of this was during World War I. By Christmas of 1917, the United States had been actively involved in the war for 8 months. American troops were fighting in Europe, and the home front was dealing with rationing, war bonds, and the constant anxiety of waiting for news from the front. President Woodrow Wilson and his wife, Edith, decided that the White House Christmas decorations should be minimal that year. There was still a tree, but it was smaller and less elaborate than in previous years. The usual holiday receptions and parties were either canceled or scaled back dramatically. The White House, which had always been a symbol of American celebration and prosperity, became more subdued and serious, reflecting the national mood. This wasn't just about optics, though that was certainly part of it. There were also practical concerns about resources. The war effort required conservation of materials, including the fuel needed to generate electricity. Elaborate lighting displays, which had become increasingly common in the years leading up to the war, were seen as wasteful when fuel needed to be conserved for the war effort. So the White House, along with many American homes and businesses, reduced their lighting displays. It was part of the broader culture of sacrifice and conservation that characterized the home front during World War I. By World War II, these patterns were even more pronounced. From 1941 through 1945, the White House Christmas decorations were significantly reduced. The outdoor lighting that had become traditional for the national Christmas tree was suspended entirely. The tree was still there, but it remained dark, a symbolic gesture acknowledging that these were not times for celebration. Inside the White House, decorations were modest. Franklin Roosevelt, who loved Christmas and usually went all out with decorations and festivities, toned everything down during the war years. There were also genuine security concerns. Washington, D.C. was worried about potential attacks, particularly after Pearl Harbor. Blackout drills were common. Buildings were supposed to minimize their external lighting to make them less visible as potential targets. The White House, being perhaps the most symbolic target in the country, took these concerns seriously. Keeping the building lit up like a Christmas display would have been both a security risk and a violation of the wartime restrictions that ordinary Americans were being asked to follow. Roosevelt did maintain some Christmas traditions during the war, but they were private, family-oriented celebrations rather than the grand public events of peacetime. He still read A Christmas Carol to his family on Christmas Eve. There was still a tree in the residence. But the White House wasn't throwing lavish holiday parties or inviting thousands of people to tour the decorations. The building felt quieter, more somber, more focused on the serious work of running a country at war than on celebrating the holidays. The 1944 Christmas was particularly poignant. By then, the Allies were clearly winning, but victory wasn't certain yet, and Americans were still dying in Europe and the Pacific. Roosevelt gave a Christmas Eve radio address in which he acknowledged the difficulty of celebrating while so many families had empty chairs at their tables. He spoke about the service members who were spending Christmas in foxholes and on ships far from home, and he framed the lack of elaborate celebration not as deprivation but as solidarity with those who were making much greater sacrifices. After the war ended in 1945, there was some debate about when and how to resume full Christmas celebrations at the White House. Victory in Europe came in May of that year, but fighting in the Pacific continued until August. By December, the war was over, but the country was still in transition, still processing the enormous trauma and loss of the previous 4 years. Harry Truman, who would become president after Roosevelt's death in April, decided to bring back the national Christmas tree lighting ceremony in December of 1945, but it was a modified version, celebratory but not excessive, acknowledging both the relief of peace and the memory of what had been lost. The pattern repeated during later conflicts, though less dramatically. During the Korean War in the early 1950s, the White House decorations were somewhat restrained. During the Vietnam War, particularly in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when the conflict was most controversial, there was tension about how elaborate the Christmas celebrations should be. Some first ladies felt that maintaining traditions was important for national morale. Others worried about appearing tone-deaf to the suffering caused by the war. The 1970s also brought energy crises that affected White House Christmas decorations for different reasons. The oil embargo and fuel shortages meant that elaborate lighting displays felt inappropriate, even without an active war. President Ford and later President Carter both reduced outdoor lighting as a symbolic gesture encouraging energy conservation. Carter's approach was particularly austere. He had the national Christmas tree lit for only a short period each evening, and some years he didn't light it at all, linking the darkness to various international crises and encouraging Americans to think about those suffering around the world. What all of these instances share is a recognition that White House Christmas celebrations aren't just about the first family or even about the building itself. They're national symbols, and when the nation is suffering or struggling, those symbols need to reflect that reality. Dimming the decorations during wartime wasn't about being depressing or canceling Christmas. It was about acknowledging that not everyone could celebrate, that resources were needed elsewhere, and that sometimes the most appropriate response to hardship is restraint rather than excess. Though even during peacetime, not everything about White House Christmas is visible to the public. The White House has a special holiday china pattern. Here's a detail that most people never think about. When the president hosts a formal Christmas dinner at the White House, the food isn't served on just any plates. There's actually a specific china pattern that's reserved for holiday dinners, a set that only comes out during the Christmas season and then gets carefully packed away for the rest of the year. It's one of those traditions that exists in the background, noticed primarily by the people who work in the White House residence and by the very small number of guests who are invited to formal holiday dinners and happen to pay attention to dishware. The tradition of having special holiday china isn't as old as some other White House Christmas traditions. It seems to have developed in the mid 20th century as first ladies became more intentional about creating cohesive holiday themes and presentations. Before that, the White House certainly had fine china that was used for formal dinners, but it wasn't necessarily designated specifically for holiday use. The development of holiday specific china reflected a broader trend toward specialization and theming in White House entertaining. Different administrations have had different approaches to holiday china. Some first ladies commissioned entirely new patterns designed specifically for Christmas use. Others selected from the existing White House china collection, choosing patterns that seemed particularly appropriate for holiday entertaining. Usually designs that incorporated gold trim, festive colors, or elegant but not overly formal aesthetics. The key was finding or creating china that felt special and celebratory without being so ornate that it overshadowed the food or felt uncomfortable to eat from. The china service includes all the components you'd need for a formal multi-course dinner. Dinner plates, salad plates, bread plates, soup bowls, cups and saucers, and various serving pieces. We're talking about settings for dozens of people, because White House holiday dinners aren't intimate family affairs. They're often state dinners or formal receptions with extensive guest lists. So the holiday china collection needs to be large enough to accommodate these events, which means multiple complete sets that can be rotated as needed. Maintaining and storing this china is its own specialized task. The pieces are expensive, often irreplaceable, and historically significant. They can't just be tossed in a standard kitchen cabinet or run through a commercial dishwasher. Each piece needs to be hand washed by trained staff who understand how to handle delicate porcelain and gilt trim. After washing, the pieces are dried carefully and inspected for any chips or damage. Then they're wrapped individually in protective materials and stored in climate-controlled conditions until the next holiday season. The White House China collection more broadly is actually managed almost like a museum collection, which makes sense given that some pieces date back to administrations from the 19th century. There are curators and documentation systems. Each piece is cataloged and tracked. When china is used for an event, there's a record of what was used, when, and for what purpose. And the holiday china, being part of this larger collection, receives the same careful treatment and documentation. For the staff who work in the White House residence, the appearance of the holiday china is one of the markers that the season has officially begun. It's like when stores start playing Christmas music, or when someone in your neighborhood puts up their outdoor lights. It signals that the holidays have arrived. The butlers and servers who will be using the china for holiday events are reminded of the special handling procedures. The kitchen staff plans their presentations knowing what serving pieces will be available. The chief usher coordinates with the First Lady's office to make sure the china choice aligns with the overall holiday theme and decor. Most guests who attend White House holiday dinners probably don't realize they're eating from special holiday china. Unless you're particularly interested in dishware, or someone points it out to you, you might just think, oh, nice plates, and move on with your dinner conversation. But for the White House staff, every detail matters, and the china is part of creating a specific atmosphere and experience. It's part of the overall presentation that makes a White House dinner feel different from eating anywhere else. And like many White House traditions, the holiday china reflects a tension between continuity and change. Each administration inherits the existing collection, but can also add to it or make different choices about what to use. Some first ladies love the historical china and choose pieces from previous administrations, specifically because of their connection to White House history. Others prefer to commission new patterns that reflect their own taste and vision. Both approaches are valid, and both contribute to the evolving tradition of White House holiday entertaining. The whole thing is very much in keeping with how the White House functions generally. There are these layers of tradition and protocol and careful preservation, but there's also room for individual preference and contemporary relevance. The holiday china is just one small part of this larger system, but it's a telling detail about how much thought and effort goes into creating White House Christmas celebrations that feel both timeless and current, both historically connected and personally meaningful to each first family. But not every president embraced elaborate Christmas celebrations with the same enthusiasm. Not all presidents celebrated Christmas the same way. Some barely celebrated at all. So here's something that might surprise you. Not all presidents were particularly enthusiastic about Christmas. Some celebrated it quite modestly, and a few seemed to view the whole holiday season as more of an obligation than a joy. This had various causes: religious beliefs, personal temperament, family circumstances, but it meant that the White House Christmas experience varied dramatically depending on who was living there. Take Calvin Coolidge, who we've already discussed starting the national Christmas tree tradition. Coolidge participated in public Christmas events because it was part of his presidential duties, but his personal attitude toward the holidays was complicated by tragedy. His younger son, Calvin Jr., died in July of 1924 from blood poisoning after developing a blister while playing tennis on the White House courts. He was just 16 years old. Coolidge never really recovered from this loss. He became even more withdrawn and melancholic than he'd been before, which is saying something given his naturally reserved personality. The Christmases he celebrated after his son's death were reportedly quite subdued affairs, at least privately. The public saw the ceremonial moments, but within the White House residence, the holiday was marked with quiet grief as much as any celebration. Herbert Hoover, who succeeded Coolidge, came from a Quaker background. While Hoover himself wasn't particularly devout as an adult, his Quaker upbringing had emphasized simplicity and service over elaborate celebration. His Christmases at the White House were respectful but not extravagant. The Hoovers maintained appropriate decorations and hosted necessary events, but there wasn't a sense of joy or enthusiasm about it. This was partly temperament. Hoover was serious and reserved, and partly because his presidency coincided with the Great Depression. It's hard to celebrate extravagantly when millions of Americans are unemployed and hungry. The Hoovers tried to strike a balance between maintaining traditions and being sensitive to the national crisis. Richard Nixon is another interesting case. Nixon did all the public Christmas events that were expected of him, and Pat Nixon was actually quite enthusiastic about White House holiday decorations. But Nixon personally seemed to view Christmas as more of a professional obligation than a personal pleasure. There are accounts from staff members and family describing Nixon as somewhat distant during holiday celebrations, going through the motions but not particularly engaged. This might have been his general personality. Nixon was famously awkward in social situations, or it might have reflected the pressures of his presidency, particularly during the later years when Watergate was unfolding. Some presidents celebrated Christmas, but did so in ways that were culturally or religiously different from the mainstream Protestant traditions that dominated White House celebrations for most of American history. John F. Kennedy, being Catholic, brought a different perspective to the holiday. The Kennedy family's Christmas traditions included attending midnight mass on Christmas Eve, which became a notable part of their public presidential Christmas routine. This was unusual enough at the time that it received press coverage and commentary, though it seems unremarkable now. Lyndon Johnson celebrated Christmas enthusiastically, but his style was distinctly Texan and somewhat different from the more formal Eastern establishment approach of some other administrations. Johnson liked things big and loud. His Christmases featured generous gift-giving, elaborate meals, and a kind of boisterous energy that not everyone found comfortable. Lady Bird Johnson worked to maintain elegance and tradition in the public spaces, but LBJ's personal style was less refined than what the White House staff was used to. Jimmy Carter brought his own Baptist traditions to White House Christmases. The Carter family was deeply religious, and their Christmas celebrations emphasized the spiritual aspects of the holiday. They attended church services and read scripture as part of their family traditions. The White House decorations during the Carter years were tasteful but relatively modest compared to some other administrations. This reflected both Carter's personal values and his awareness of the economic struggles many Americans were facing during his presidency. More recently, different presidents have brought their own approaches. The Clintons celebrated Christmas with obvious enthusiasm and family warmth. The Bushes, both father and son, were comfortable with traditional Protestant Christmas celebrations. The Obamas brought a contemporary feel to White House holidays while respecting historical traditions. The Trumps favored elaborate, glamorous decorations, and each of these approaches has reflected both personal preferences and broader cultural contexts. The point is that White House Christmas celebrations have never been one size fits all. They've always been shaped by the personalities, beliefs, and circumstances of the families living there. The public sees certain standard elements, the tree, the decorations, the formal events, but the private reality of how each first family actually experiences and celebrates Christmas has varied enormously. Some presidents loved it, some tolerated it, some were going through personal tragedies that made celebration painful. And all of them had to balance their personal feelings with the public expectations and ceremonial requirements of the role. Though regardless of how enthusiastically each president celebrated, certain practical tasks had to be completed. The White House Christmas card room is real. There's a room in the White House. Actually, it's often multiple rooms, depending on the space available in a given year, that becomes dedicated entirely to Christmas card operations starting around mid-November. It's not an official name or a permanent designation, but the staff calls it the Christmas card room, and if you saw it during the peak weeks of card preparation, you'd understand why it needs its own space. We're talking about tens of thousands of Christmas cards that need to be signed, addressed, stamped, and mailed, and the logistics of managing this operation are genuinely impressive. Let's start with the numbers. The exact count varies by administration, but modern presidents typically send somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 Christmas cards each year. That's not a typo. We're talking about enough cards to fill multiple rooms, requiring teams of people working full-time for weeks to process them all. The recipients include members of Congress, foreign leaders and ambassadors, campaign supporters, donors, staff members current and former, members of the press, personal friends, and various other individuals who have some connection to the administration or who the president wants to acknowledge during the holidays. The process begins months earlier with the design and printing of the cards. The First Lady's office usually leads this, working with designers and printers to create cards that reflect the chosen holiday theme and feel appropriately presidential. Once the design is finalized and approved, a specialized printer produces the cards, which have to meet certain quality standards because they're representing the President of the United States, and delivers them to the White House in huge shipments. These cards arrive in pallets and boxes and take up significant storage space even before any work has been done on them. Then comes the addressing. A database contains information about who should receive cards, including their current addresses and any specific personalization details. In modern times, this is computerized, but the actual address printing still requires careful quality control. Someone needs to verify that addresses are correct, that names are spelled properly, that the formatting looks right. Errors do happen. Cards occasionally get sent to deceased individuals or wrong addresses, but the staff works hard to minimize these problems. The signing is perhaps the most time-intensive part of the operation. The president and first lady sit down for multiple sessions, usually spread over several days or even weeks, and sign cards. Sometimes they sign their full names. Sometimes they use initials. Sometimes they add a brief personal note to cards going to close friends or particularly important contacts. But regardless of the approach, they're looking at signing thousands of cards each, which is physically exhausting. Your hand cramps, your signature starts getting sloppier, you lose track of how many you've done. It's one of those tasks that sounds simple but becomes grueling through sheer repetition. The Christmas card room during this period is organized like a small factory floor. There are stations for different tasks. One area handles the signed cards, checking them and matching them with addressed envelopes. Another area deals with the stuffing. Each card needs to go into its envelope properly, which is trickier than it sounds when you're doing thousands of them. Another section handles the stamping and sealing. And throughout all of this, there are quality control checks to catch any errors before cards go out. The human element of this operation is worth noting. Some of the work is done by White House staff as part of their regular duties, but much of it relies on volunteers, usually people with connections to the administration, who are willing to come in and help with the card project. These volunteers might be retired government employees, supporters who want to contribute, or individuals who just find the whole thing interesting and want to participate. They're supervised by experienced staff members who make sure everything's being done correctly, but the volunteer component is essential because the White House simply doesn't have enough regular staff to handle this volume of work. The mailing logistics are also complex. You can't just walk down to your local post office with 50,000 Christmas cards. The White House coordinates with the U.S. Postal Service to handle the outgoing mail, and there are specific procedures for processing and dispatching this volume of mail efficiently. International cards have additional requirements related to customs, forms, and international postage rates. Everything needs to be sorted properly so the postal system can handle it efficiently. And timing matters. The cards need to arrive before Christmas, but not so early that they seem premature. The sweet spot is usually mid-December, which means the White House needs to finish all the preparation work by early December at the latest. This creates a compressed timeline where everything has to happen efficiently and correctly, with no room for major delays or errors. The whole operation costs significant amounts of money for the cards themselves, the printing, the postage, the staff time, and the volunteer coordination. These costs come from various budgets depending on the nature of the recipients. Cards going to official government contacts might be covered by certain funds, while cards to personal friends or campaign supporters would be handled differently. The accounting for all of this is its own separate challenge. What's remarkable is that this massive operation happens every single year, and most Americans have no idea it's occurring. If you've ever received a White House Christmas card, you were part of this system, but you probably didn't think much about how it got to you. You might have noticed that the signature looked real, or you might have appreciated the card's design, but you probably didn't imagine the weeks of work and the dedicated room full of volunteers that made that single card possible. And speaking of hidden spaces where holiday work happens, there's a secret underground workshop for holiday prep. Let's end with one of the more fascinating architectural secrets of the White House. There are spaces underneath and around the building that most people never see. And during the Christmas season, these spaces become workshops where much of the actual holiday preparation happens. We're not talking about Santa's workshop here. We're talking about the very real, very practical spaces where electricians test light strings, where florists construct elaborate garland arrangements, where maintenance crews build the framework for various decorations, and where all the messy, complicated behind-the-scenes work happens that eventually produces the polished Christmas displays the public sees. The White House has an entire infrastructure of support spaces that aren't part of the public tours or the residence where the first family lives. There are workshops, storage areas, mechanical rooms, and various utility spaces that exist purely to support the building's functions. Some of these are in the basement levels, others are in connected buildings or structures that form part of the White House complex. During the holiday season, these spaces get repurposed for Christmas preparation work. The floral shop, which exists year round, but becomes especially important during the holidays, is where teams of professional florists work to create all the greenery arrangements that decorate the White House. Fresh garlands, wreaths, and centerpieces don't just appear magically. They're constructed by hand using thousands of individual pieces of greenery, wire, ribbon, and other materials. The florists work in shifts, sometimes around the clock, during the main decorating period, building these arrangements in the workshop and then transporting them to their final locations throughout the building. The workshop has to be climate controlled to keep the greenery fresh, well lit so the workers can see what they're doing, and large enough to accommodate both the work and the storage of materials. The carpentry and electrical shops also become crucial during Christmas preparation. Many White House decorations require structural support: frameworks that hold wreaths in place, stands for trees, mounting systems for garlands. These aren't things you can buy at a store. They're custom built by the White House maintenance staff to meet specific requirements. Similarly, the electrical systems that power all those Christmas lights need to be designed, tested, and installed by professionals who understand both the electrical requirements and the historical significance of the building. You can't just drill holes wherever you want or run extension cords along the walls. Everything has to be done carefully to preserve the building while also making the decorations work properly. There's also coordination space where the various teams, florists, electricians, housekeeping, ushers, security, meet to plan and coordinate their work. The transformation of the White House from its everyday appearance to its full Christmas glory involves dozens of people working on interdependent tasks. The garlands can't be hung until the structural framework is installed. The lights can't be tested until the trees are in place. The wreaths need to wait until the doors and windows have been cleaned and prepared. All of this requires careful scheduling and coordination, which happens in planning spaces that most visitors never see. The underground and back of house spaces also serve as routes for moving materials and equipment without disrupting the public areas or the first family's private spaces. Imagine trying to move an 18-foot Christmas tree through the front door while tourists are taking pictures. It doesn't work. Instead, materials come in through service entrances and move through back corridors and service routes that allow workers to access different parts of the building without being visible to visitors or residents. These routes exist year-round for regular maintenance and service work, but during Christmas preparation, they become especially important because of the sheer volume of material that needs to move through the building. The whole setup reveals something important about how the White House actually functions. The building we see in photographs and on television, the elegant public spaces, the perfectly decorated rooms, the impressive displays, exists because of a hidden infrastructure of workspaces and service routes and dedicated professionals who make it all happen. The magic isn't really magic. It's expertise, planning, and hard work happening in spaces most people don't know exist. And when the decorating is finally finished and the White House is open for holiday tours, the public sees the results but not the process. They don't see the underground workshop where electricians spent days testing light strings. They don't see the climate-controlled room where florists built hundreds of feet of fresh garland. They don't see the planning sessions or the coordination meetings or the service routes where workers moved materials at odd hours to avoid disrupting other activities. They just see a beautifully decorated building and might think, "Oh, that's nice," without realizing the enormous effort required to create that effect. This is true of most presidential work, actually. What the public sees is the finished product. The speech, the ceremony, the photo opportunity. What they don't see is all the preparation, planning, and behind-the-scenes work that makes those moments possible. The White House Christmas decorations are just a particularly visible example of this principle. The underground workshops and support spaces aren't secrets in the sense that the White House tries to hide them. They're just not part of the story most people think about when they imagine Christmas at the White House. But they're essential to making the whole thing work, and the people who labor in those spaces, often anonymously, often for long hours, always with professional pride, deserve recognition for creating something that brings joy to millions of people each year. And that brings us to the end of our tour through White House Christmas secrets. From underground workshops to charity trees to presidents who barely celebrated at all. Here's what strikes me about all this. We spend so much time thinking about presidents as these distant, formal figures making enormous decisions that shape history. And they did. They do. But they also chased goats down Pennsylvania Avenue. They hung laundry in unfinished ballrooms. They sat for hours signing Christmas cards until their hands cramped. They made gingerbread houses that weighed 300 pounds for absolutely no practical reason, except that it seemed like a nice thing to do. The White House is a museum, a fortress, a workplace, and a symbol. But during Christmas, it's also just a house where people try to make the holidays special, even when the world outside is falling apart. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, maybe take some comfort in knowing that even the most powerful people in history still had to figure out where to put the Christmas tree. Sleep well.